Hi everyone, my name is Jenna Riedl, I use she, her pronouns, and my Keystone is entitled The Edges of Freedom. I interviewed young adult conservatives in the Boston area about their beliefs on how the government is regulating and should regulate queer people. And I wanted to do this project because I'm queer, and as we try to move towards a society where queer people really are free to express themselves, I think it's important to understand the beliefs of people who would choose to associate with a group that has traditionally been invested in denying that freedom. Two of the terms I used a lot during my research were social conservative and queer expression. I interviewed people who were socially conservative as opposed to just fiscally conservative, and social conservatism is a political ideology that focuses on traditional values. Key things that respondents mentioned were family structure, small government and personal freedoms, and respect for existing traditions and institutions. And secondly, I talked a lot about queer expression, which I defined throughout my research as the ways queer people in the LGBTQ+ community, express themselves, especially in public spaces. And these are things like dress and appearance, speech, and media they consume and create, especially things that are related to their queerness or make other people aware of their queerness. And I was primarily interested in looking at the cognitive dissonance that seems to take place within the Conservative Party, where on the one hand, conservatism is really big on freedom of personal expression and freedom of speech. On the other hand, the Republican Party, the dominant conservative party in the US, advocates for the government to restrict and regulate queer expression and queer speech. So, on an individual level, do people believe both of those things? And if so, how do they reconcile that? Because they seem to be opposing viewpoints. I was specifically interested in young adult conservatives because this is a generation that has grown up with more exposure to queer people as opposed to previous generations, and because young adults will have a longer-term impact on the political landscape in the Conservative Party. A lot of the existing research out there focuses on the rhetorical strategies that media and conservative platforms use in order to convince people of their viewpoints. And while there's a couple of different specifics that I can get into later, all of these strategies generally focused on minimization, which is saying if you've got two opposing things, say on the one hand freedom of personal expression, on the other hand restriction of queer expression, at any given point in time you're trying to convince people that one of those is really, really central and important, and the other one is a little bit less so. But what I wanted to know is, so this is what the research is talking about the intent of media and of conservative platforms. But is this actually what young adult conservatives believe, and are these the logical thought processes that they're using to get there? So I used interviews as the bulk of my research, and I generally covered three areas. First, I talked with respondents about their beliefs on queer people and their sources of information about queer people. Secondly, we talked about their conservatism, what beliefs fell under that, especially related to government regulation. And finally, we talked about what they understood to be laws that currently affect queer people and how they thought those should change or not. And although the point of this research is not to generalize, because like any political ideology, I got a wide range of responses, here are some of the commonalities and trends that I noticed. Firstly, a lot of responses took issue with the term queer people, saying that it was inaccurate because it's a monolith. I mean, even in my definition, I say members of the LGBTQ+ community. And the respondents said that because each of those subgroups of people is often treated differently, socially and legally, that it's inaccurate to lump them all into one category. For legislation, there was universal support among the respondents for queer marriage. There was also widespread support for gender-neutral bathrooms and for age-appropriate queer education, although what people considered age-appropriate did vary. The most common response was that it should happen around middle school. The areas with the greatest opposition and reservations were about social and medical transitioning, especially for transgender children. A fair number of the respondents thought that medical transitioning should not be allowed for children at all, and a small but critical minority also said that social transitioning shouldn't be allowed, so things like using a child's preferred pronouns or letting them dress in clothing that they would feel comfortable in. And finally, about queer expression as a term, a lot of people had this broad idea that yes, queer people should be free to express themselves, but some of the respondents said that if there was backlash against that, so if they faced some sort of verbal insults, that shouldn't be punished unless it was explicitly violent or threatening. But in that case, that would not just be related to queer people. Anybody who is experiencing violence or threats in public should be protected. And this kind of comes from a viewpoint where queer people, yes, are free to express themselves, but also other people who don't believe that queer people should have rights should also be free to express themselves, which comes from a belief that both parties involved would experience equal harm in that interaction, which is untrue. I would like to close by looking at these two quotes, which I think really exemplify one of the promising trends that I found in my research. On the left, we've got a quote from an interviewee who was straight and said that as a straight person who did not have a lot of close queer friends and didn't really have an incentive to seek out queer-related issues, they didn't know what rights queer people were looking for that they didn't have. Whereas on the right side, we have a person who, while not being queer, had close queer connections where they explicitly talked about queer experiences with those people. And they felt that the additional legal protection would just guarantee queer people the same rights that everybody else has, just like with other marginalized communities. And I think a main trend that I saw among people who voiced any opposition to laws that would help queer people or supported laws that could harm queer people, they often said, oh, that's unrelated to the impact on queer people. I don't care about that part. And while that might be true, it shows that the effect of legislation on queer people just wasn't a central part of their determination in whether to support or oppose certain platforms. However, when people did have those personal connections, they were more likely to understand and articulate the effects of laws on queer people and understand the personal and individual impact of that. And they were less likely to be able to sidestep or rationalize that by saying that their intent was unrelated to their impact. So while it's very difficult for queer people and conservative people to engage in conversations, this research, there's 2 minutes remaining, that blindsided me. There's a lot of promise in holding those dialogues because it means that the conservative respondents were much more likely to take into account the effect of legislation on queer people as a central tenet of their decision whether to support or harm or oppose that particular piece of legislation or that platform or that law. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will take them now.
On the last slide, you were asking about, you asked your participants about specific laws. Which ones did you discuss, and what were the most shocking things you heard in response?
There was a lot of different legislation discussed. I think a lot of the big ones that came up were ones that have been flashpoints in the media, so things like bathroom regulation bills, where most people said that any sort of practices that would require testing of people would be a major government overreach, and that people should just be allowed to use a bathroom. But a lot of people, I think, supported gender-neutral bathrooms also because that's kind of an alternative and non-inflammatory option where they don't really need to think about the issue of whether or not people are actually using a bathroom, and they would be uncomfortable with people who identify as trans using that bathroom. And another main point was things related to education and whether students should be educated on queer issues. And there was a big variety of responses there, but I did take comfort in the fact that everybody believed that there should be a certain level of queer education, and a lot of people said that it shouldn't really be an issue before the age of 10, because that's not an area where a lot of people would be considering queer issues, which as a person who knew that they were queer before the age of 10 would not entirely agree with that statement, but that more explicit queer education should be around the same time as sex ed.
This is a really nice talk, Jenna. I'm curious in your conversations if you consider or thought that you had an educational component in the conversations that you had and vice versa. So what did you and your respondents learn from each other?
Yeah, I think the role of myself as an interviewer was generally not to interject my viewpoint, so I think I had less of an educational component, but I think I did learn a lot because a lot of these points did contradict dominant narratives about what the Conservative Party believes, which I felt were pretty encouraging in terms of queer people having greater protection and legislative rights in the future. So I felt like a lot of the education that I got was around what young adult conservatives believe, because a lot of the research and discourse before that did not say that conservatives would support things like queer marriage.
I missed a bit about the age of your population study. I'm sorry. So, but I just imagine that you could have conversations with older, socially conservative people who wouldn't know what you were talking about. So
Yeah, which is
since they weren't
something
in your study.
I would really like to do in the future is
Okay.
a wider age range and also wider geographic range, because Boston is not what we would call a hub of conservative thought. So it would definitely be cool in the future to look at a variation of different geographic areas.
Thanks again.
Oh boy.
So, Jenny, your study focused on asking conservatives their views about kind of queer-related topics. In your preparing for this, did you think about the converse, about how queer individuals or individuals who identify as queer, how they may view so-called conservative views? Is that another aspect, and
Yeah.
what did you learn about that?
Yeah, and actually an interesting subgroup within this category was some of the respondents were queer and conservative, and I thought that was a really interesting subgroup to look at. And one of the dominant things that that group talked about was how, although they are conservative, they don't agree with the current Republican Party. They think real conservatism would be the government not being involved in their personal expression, and that since freedom of personal expression is such a core component of conservatism, that the Republican Party is actually scapegoating queer people, and that that's not how conservatism should be. But definitely, I think that's part of the issue with having these dialogues between queer people and conservative people, is that queer people have a difficult time engaging in conversations that are about proving their existence or their rights. It's a different level of emotional labor for them in that conversation than it is for the conservative people.
Thanks, Jenna. So just kind of, you mentioned that it would be great to expand this to a greater age range and a greater kind of regional range. And while, I'm sure that's true, it's a very generative method. Could you just spell out a little bit the value of this particular group? Like, what do we learn from this particular like level of conservatism and this specific kind of stance that you were getting from these people that might be productive?
I think that the main thing that I got from this is that generally, although not to generalize too much because it was a small study, but that as the age of conservative people drops, like the younger generations are more likely to support queer-related legislation. Although specifically related to trans queer people, there still seems to be a fair amount of opposition to protections for them. But for like queer marriage and queer education, there's a lot more support. And I think that I was very interested in looking at this subgroup because they will likely have an impact on the political landscape for 20, 30, 40 years. And they'll be the ones voting new people into office, maybe running for offices themselves, and really affecting legislation or proposing legislation within the party. So if they have differences in opinion versus other generations, that'll be really important to predicting how in the future that might impact the rights that queer people might have.